Hello, I'm Jeff M. Brown, a legal writer with the State Bar of Wisconsin. I'm here today to talk with Dr. Michele Statz. Dr. Statz will be one of the presenters at the State Bar's Equal Justice Conference, which is scheduled to be held on March 10. The conference will bring together Wisconsin lawyers and others to share information on access to justice for low-income Wisconsinites. The conference will feature panels on pandemic challenges and opportunities in legal aid, the prevention and defense of eviction actions, the pursuit of racial justice and equity in legal aid, and improving rural access to justice. Dr. Statz is an assistant professor with the University of Minnesota's Medical School in the Department of Family Medicine and Biobehavioral Health. She is also a member of the faculty at the university's law school and its Human Rights Center. Dr. Statz obtained her PhD in sociocultural anthropology, comparative law, and social studies from the University of Washington in 2014. Welcome, Dr. Statz.
Thank you for having me.
So what is an anthropologist of law?
So it's a nice grab bag, I suppose. I'm trained in anthropology and specifically sociocultural anthropology. So the sorts of jokes about bones and dinosaurs fall flat with me. And I specifically look at legal institutions. My first book was on immigration courts, and the experiences of young migrants who cross the border clandestinely into the United States and are put in detention centers and removal proceedings. And in the course of doing that research, I moved from kind of traditional gateway cities like New York, San Francisco, Chicago, to look at the work of immigration attorneys in smaller towns, what are often characterized as new destinations for immigrants. And I'm from a small town in Wisconsin myself, and realized that the work of those attorneys was often far more effective than those in kind of more competitive spaces like New York, but also that I could speak the language of small town, and that very few sociolegal scholars were paying attention to the kinds of workings of small town courts and tribal courts. And so to answer your question, I think an anthropologist of law is just about anything they want to be, but most generally does kind of comparative work on how individuals understand law and how people mobilize rights. When they don't, why not? And specifically for me, at least, how justice is understood by so many different individuals who move through court systems. So I'm kind of uniquely specific to the United States, and in particular the Upper Midwest. But a lot of anthropologists of law would do comparative work that compares national legal systems. So mine is a bit more refined in scope.
Well, you mentioned jokes about dinosaur bones, and I wasn't going to make a joke and not about dinosaur bones, but I was going to make the point that when people hear anthropology of law, they probably think about looking at fragments of, the Code of Hammurabi or something.
Yeah. Some do that, actually. So I guess that one works a little better. But no Indiana Jones references, please.
Can you talk a little bit about how modern problems lend themselves to an anthropological analysis?
Yeah, so I think sociocultural anthropology is a very modern endeavor, right? It's not archaeology. So we are concerned with the kind of unique and I think urgently shifting contexts in which law is enacted and performed and experienced. And so by the nature of my work, I pay a lot of attention to changes in policy. And then I do a lot of on the ground work, which I love, but which might not be quite as sexy, right? And just think about how very, very different individuals and people groups across rural spaces experience those arguable top-down changes in real time.
Are some of those changes being sped up by factors, say climate change, demographics, economics?
Yes, absolutely. So I can't not talk about things like rural economic marginalization, which I think is, of course, implicating climate change, et cetera, in unique ways. So I'm thinking in particular about, say, changes in logging in northern Wisconsin, by virtue of the fact that the ground isn't frozen as long throughout the winter as it used to be. And so some of those practices have changed, and some of those rural economies have changed as a result. Same thing in northern Minnesota where I live. But I think too, and I don't want to get too overtly political or heavy-handed here, but just thinking about some of the very, very long-term impacts of, say, Act 10, right, in Wisconsin, where I encounter a lot of different state bar associations, access to justice commissions, equal justice committees, who are all very legitimately concerned about rural attorney recruitment and retention. And I don't think we can not talk about the impacts of policies like that, particularly if, they've effectively gutted school systems or led to different kinds of professional shortages in rural areas.
One of the things I came across in doing some background on your work is sociospatial dimensions of rurality. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, that's a really jargony term, isn't it? And it's so funny because I literally was writing about it right before I opened Zoom to talk to you. So again, I engage these sociospatial dimensions from an access to justice perspective. And a lot of scholars have focused on the different kinds of barriers and gaps that keep diverse rural community members from accessing justice. So those could be kind of functions of the landscape, like long distances between services, or inclement weather, or in northern Wisconsin or Minnesota, a lot of road construction during the winter. But then when you bring in like the socio aspects, oftentimes that's where poverty is kind of implicated. So thinking about that spatial side of things, but what does that look like if you don't have a reliable car, or if you don't have consistent childcare, right? Like, how do you access those certain kinds of services when certain social supports just aren't there, or aren't there with the kind of consistency and robustness that you might need elsewhere, or you might get elsewhere. I'm thinking also of things like drug treatment centers. That's something we encounter a lot in our research. Mental health supports, all of those dimensions of living in rural areas that often compound legal needs or impact people's abilities to address issues that then become legal needs, or justiciable issues, if you will.
So it seems like there's a kind of a knock-on effect there. There's the distance, so greater time needs to be spent traveling to places to get some of those needs met. Mm-hmm. And then there's the fact that a lot of those needs, a lot of the things you need to do in order to travel that distance, like childcare, are increasingly less available. So it's sort of a vicious cycle.
Right. And then there's, of course, as we all know, a lot of conversation around like digital deserts. And there's been a lot of growing policy attention to broadband access. I would highlight, though, that in the areas where I do work, even consistent cellular is something that you can't take for granted. So, for instance, I think in 2018 in Bayfield County, there was a partnership between Red Cliff Band and then the county to put up new cellular towers after a really tragic incident on the lake. And with one cellular tower, this region that is populated went from 20% to 80% cell service in 2018. And 80% is not 100%, right? Like, but prior to 2018, to think that it was only 20% coverage in a populated rural area is really, I think, devastating in terms of that not getting meaningful policy attention.
Well, and some of those coverage area maps are a mystery. I too come from a small town in Wisconsin. It's about 30 miles from Madison. So I guess technically it's rural, less so as storage units and or urban sprawl occurs, but they're still dotted with farms. And I grew up out in the country, and I worked down there for my hometown newspaper for quite a while before I took this position. And I would be sitting at my desk in the newspaper, and on my cell phone, and there was no signal. I couldn't text. I couldn't get my email. It would go in and out almost like the weather. And I couldn't figure out how that was the case in a city that was, half an hour from Madison.
Right. Where were you, Jeff?
Edgerton, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. I grew up in Portage.
Oh, okay. Portage, just north of here.
Direction.
Do these types of things, are they features that make up what you call the rural lawscape?
Yes, and that's another somewhat jargony term, right? But I work fairly closely with Lisa Pruitt, who's on law faculty at UC Davis, and she's literally the one person who has been doing work on law and rurality for decades. It was probably only within the past 3 to 4 years, I'd say, that more scholars, whether law scholars or sociolegal scholars, are finally paying attention to rural areas in the US.
Since 2017, you've been involved with the Northland Project, which explores life in legal deserts across the upper Midwest and seeks to understand barriers to accessing justice in rural communities. What has that experience been like?
It's been great. So I was able to get that research off the ground with a National Science Foundation grant in 2017. And it's been an unbelievable honor to do that work. And it's also been a lot easier than I would have otherwise expected. I think simply because there is such an experience of urgency among so many diverse rural community members. And it's really important to me to highlight rurality as like intrinsically intersectional. So I kind of try to push against this view of rural Wisconsin as like inevitably white. And so I think just by virtue of being someone who like is genuinely committed to these issues and is willing to do the drive, I've had access to really just profoundly different community groups and individuals across what I call the Northland, right? Northeastern Minnesota, spanning northern Wisconsin, to the point where now I have, I'd say, pretty good collaborative relationships across a number of tribal courts. I partner with a number of tribal court judges and state court judges. And all of that was kind of based on that research that started in 2017, where I worked with private attorneys, public interest or legal aid attorneys. I did a lot of legal aid assessments for Judicare and also Legal Aid Service of Northeastern Minnesota. Did a lot of observational work. So sat in on different community meetings. I did a ride along with EMT, which I will never do again. But just all of these like touring factories, meeting with miners, right? Like getting a sense of how so many diverse rural residents experience, if you will, the rural lawscape, and then translating that into different articles and recommendations for policymakers. I say it's an honor because I just feel like so many individuals have entrusted me with what are often very heartbreaking accounts. And so I feel very motivated and compelled to share that with a wider audience.
Great. You published a paper along with a colleague in 2020 stating that rural legal deserts are essentially hazardous to the health of rural populations. Not surprising or counterintuitive at all, but why is that? Can you go into a little more detail about how that manifests itself?
Yeah, it's not surprising, but unfortunately, these different professions just are not necessarily willing to engage this reality in a collaborative way. So yeah, this is an article that I had wanted to write for a long time and asked an MD to co-author it with me because I kind of suspected that the American Journal of Public Health would want an MD right? To give it that kind of necessary gravity, I guess, or gravitas. Yeah, but anyhow, this is something I've been seeing again and again and again and again, right? And it's something we all know, like we know these narratives of just the fact that most low-income folks do not have just one justiciable need. On average, I think they have 6 per year. Low-income rural individuals, at least. I don't know the data for suburban or urban populations. But if you think about just all of these compounding crises having to do with economic marginalization, policy marginalization, COVID-19, what does it mean if you're at risk of eviction? Or what does it mean if you're living in substandard housing and you can't get a legal aid attorney, or you don't know that such a thing as legal aid exists, and maybe there's a domestic violence issue, or you have a kid who needs some sort of special support, right? Like all of these things, the stress like of each of these things, let alone the very sort of visible physiological impacts of both that stress and of the kinds of precarity that we're witnessing, like I mentioned earlier, access to drug treatment centers, access to mental health supports, access to appropriate nutrition or prenatal supports, right? Like so many of these things implicate legal issues, but they cannot be resolved in rural places. And they're persistently overlooked by the health professions, right? And then in the legal community, they're addressed as legal needs. And one thing, a kind of frustration that I have is too often, sometimes it's simply by virtue of funding or limited capacity, legal aid will say, well, we've helped you with this legal issue, or we're qualified to help you with this legal issue because we have this grant, so we can help you with it. When in reality, if you start to peel back the layers of the onion a little bit, there are often a host of complex needs that individuals and families are bearing the burden of, but not without consequence. And when you think like, and then I'll stop talking, but I could talk about this at length. When we did the community needs assessments for Judicare and Legal Aid Service of Northeastern Minnesota, the #1 reported legal issue across all of these diverse rural populations was related to health. So accessing healthcare benefits, accessing, say, dental care, mental health services, and with an organization like Judicare, those are not cases that a place like Judicare can take on when they don't receive hardly any state funding and then are reliant on a lot of sort of grant-specific initiatives. And so that overlap is obvious, and yet the two worlds aren't necessarily talking with one another. There are still like medical legal partnerships, but those tend to be urban-based. And I always talk in my classes about like healthcare teams and know your local attorney. Like, here are some resources that you can tap into if you're a family med physician. But it's not enough. I want that conversation to be more robust and far-reaching.
What are some of the things that could be done to address the problem of rural legal deserts?
Well, this is the $1 million question, right? I'm a firm believer in direct representation. So there are some very well-intentioned access to justice initiatives that are often based on different kinds of technologies that at least theoretically can help individuals get in the door of the courthouse. I co-authored a piece that came out last year that talked about how those quote unquote supports often actually compound the stress and the legal needs that many rural individuals face simply by virtue of their inaccessibility. So oftentimes these are often premised on having a smartphone, having access to broadband, having access to cellular reception, a certain kind of technological literacy, and oftentimes a legal literacy. So for instance, having like a kiosk at a courthouse or in a courthouse law library, having access to LexisNexis or whatever else. I have a PhD and I do not know how to work that, right? Like these things that are kind of presumed A, on different kinds of literacy, and B, on an experience of being out of crisis, right? Like too often, I think there's just this assumption that everyone is an attorney, when in reality, most folks who have legal needs are in crisis. And as we've documented very, very thoroughly, the sorts of court self-help supports just aren't working, and often are experienced by low-income individuals as humiliating. And so to that end, to kind of in a circuitous way get to the answer to your question, I love attorneys, and I find, at least in my research, that individuals really want that kind of relational aspect. And sometimes I think they get it even from paralegals. So just the opportunity to sit down, have someone ask all of the right questions to elicit not only facts, but an experience of being listened to and feeling trust. I think that does a lot to not only address legal needs, but to dignify people in a way that a kiosk just can't. And so I think a lot to that end about pipeline programs. And I'm very fortunate because even though I do nothing medical, really, I happen to work at a med school that is legislatively mandated to train rural and indigenous family physicians who then serve in Indian country and rural communities. And so there's a lot of robust and longstanding work on those rural and native pipelines, whether to get into medicine or to get into STEM programs. And I think law schools would do very well to replicate some of those. And there are some law schools in the US that are starting slowly to think about rural practice. One school, Mitchell Hamlin in Minnesota, isn't overtly, trying to address that, but they do have this hybrid program that I found in my own research has been really excellent. Like I fairly frequently encounter folks who are studying or getting their JD through that program, which is really exciting. But I think any kind of exposure to lawyers and judges is really meaningful for diverse rural kids from a young age. And I can say more about that, but I don't want to get too long-winded.
Okay, thanks. Changing gears a little bit, what do you do for fun away from work?
Well, it is a pandemic. So this is so far been a good year. I'm not teaching a 7-year-old and running a preschool in our house. But I like to run a lot. I do a lot of trail running, which is, Duluth is great for a lot of reasons, and that's one of them. But yeah, I basically chase my children for fun.
Do you run Grandma's Marathon?
I don't do anything on roads. I like to be in the woods.
And then my final question, you grew up in Wisconsin. I didn't look up to see where you did your undergrad, but you now work for the University of Minnesota. So when it comes down to the Axe game, Badgers, Gophers, where do you land?
So Badgers all the way, but with one little wrinkle,
okay,
which is that one of my favorite research assistants who actually has volunteered for this project, he's so committed. He plays for the Minnesota marching band. And so we have put on our Gophers gear just to cheer him on. But when it comes to the actual sports, it's Badgers.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Statz, thanks so much for your time. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the Equal Justice Conference on March 10th.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay.